Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening at Maine's First Ship. Some of you virtually and some here at the Bath Freight Shed for the fifth presentation in our summer lecture series. Sixth. This year, this 8-part lecture, and now 9, okay, is made possible through the generosity of the Grill family. That's Maria and Chris Grill, who recently moved to Bath from Rouseck, and I understand are building a home in North Bath. So they have been longtime supporters of our project. So thank you to the Grill family for your support. Our in-person audience tonight has been enjoying this beautiful, lovely summer weather, a little warm. Some have been touring the Virginia a little earlier as she sits out at her wharf just outside our windows. And I hope that you who are watching online will find an opportunity to come by and visit the ship and spend some time in our Jane Stevens Visitor Center and just enjoy Bath in the summertime. Maine's First Ship is dedicated to building and operating a reconstruction of the 1607 ship, Virginia. This working reconstruction of the first English ship built in North America serves as a springboard for us to tell the story of the early exploration and settlement of Maine, of the first interactions between Europeans and the native people, and of Maine's centuries-old connections to the sea. We respectfully acknowledge that while living here in Maine, we are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. While we cannot remake history, we can learn from it and move forward with knowledge and respect. So part of that effort, in fact, 4 of our presentations in this year's summer lecture series, and certainly they have been very well received. They relate to the aspects of Wabanaki history or culture. You'll probably hear some of that tonight. Building the Virginia celebrates the accomplishments of the Popham Colony, but it also allows us to open new, more positive and inclusive chapters in the relationship between the peoples of European and of Native American ancestry. So we look forward to continuing that exploration of the world that we now share. Virginia and her home here at the Bath Freight Shed are the foundation for a variety of educational and community activities, all aimed at bringing to light the exciting and little-known story of the Popham Colony. Our visitor center, located at the other end of this freight shed, is open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 to 3. Our docents are eager to share the history of the Popham Colony and explain how we went about building this ship. You can keep up with our activities on social media and visit our website, www.mfship.org, for online exhibits and more. We encourage you to join our MFS community as a volunteer or as a supporter. From shipbuilding to community building, from academic research to fine art, our programs rely on the financial support of curious and compassionate businesses and individuals such as yourselves. And now, to introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to welcome Jim Parmentier.
Thank you, Phil. So tonight's speaker is Richard Seymour. He's been a clinical psychologist for the past 30 years. He's currently practicing in both Portland and Brunswick. He's a professor emeritus at Cambridge College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Beyond, the Popham Colony, the first English settlement in New England, and its sequel, The Duke of Kennebec, are books that he's written. He's also written a memoir entitled Let the Dogs Howl, which describes his experiences learning how to play the piano as an adult. Dick lives in Brunswick with his wife, Rosie Armstrong. I'm delighted to invite and welcome him here for tonight's talk.
To give you some idea how eager I was to be here, I showed up a month ahead of time on June 28th, and there was no one here. And I made the mistake of writing in my calendar June 28th, and it's in my calendar. That's the way it is. So here we are on July 28th, and I'm again pleased to be here, but there's actually some people here. So it might be a little more interesting for me. The title was When Fact Meets Fiction. So I'm to begin with not a historian, I'm a psychologist. And I was trying to figure out how do I want to talk about this? And I came to across a quote actually that was useful for me in writing my second novel. And this is a heady quote. And for those of you virtually and for those of you here, I think that quote is on a handout. And it's a Voltaire quote. And it goes, "There is no history, only fictions of varying degrees of plausibility." That's quite a bit. There is no history, only fictions of varying degrees of plausibility, says Mr. Voltaire. So it's an interesting time to think about facts and fiction. Here we are, where maybe 30% of the population thinks the presidency of the United States of Joe Biden is a fiction. Meanwhile, we have a commission that is, in my mind, doing a pretty admirable job, and we watch history in the making. And then we'll have a public that has to decide what is most plausible. And that's a word I'm going to use a fair amount, following Mr. Voltaire here. And no doubt there will be disagreement, whatever the commission decides, where I see plausibility, someone else is going to see fake news. It is dangerous, I think, when we can't figure out the difference between fiction and fact, when it gets scrambled as it is now. That's a different situation from just being skeptical. The very astute historian Timothy Snyder at Yale tells us when a large portion of the population, say in Russia now or in Nazi Germany, has been fed a lot of junk information, all information becomes unreliable and people give up trying to figure out even what is plausible. I used to think that writing historical fiction before I started writing it was kind of cheating, and that historical fiction was irresponsible. And I don't think that now, only that you have to be, I think you have to be honest with the reader. And I think honest historical fiction writers first draw on facts as best they can. And then, you know, there are some hard-nosed facts. I mean, we are here today. That's a fact. And there was a colony. People didn't know that was a fact until they actually started digging and found, yeah, that's a fact. But then there's a lot of plausibility that's involved here too. And finally, we try to create a story, if you're an historical fiction writer, and that story hopefully is compelling. And as a result of that, people become more curious about the actual events, the historical events. And so one perhaps good purpose for fiction writing is to create curiosity and more interest in the subject matter. Yes. Okay. Is that any different? Does that sound? I will. Right here sounds good. Okay, sure. So I'm here to talk about two historical fiction novels, and I'll spend most of my time talking about the first book, which is about the Popham Colony. And the second one is called The Duke of Kennebec. Some of you may have listened to Margaret Wilson's presentation, which was a week ago or 2 weeks ago. You can't believe what I say when it comes to dates, I guess. And I agree with what she said, and that is it could have been better than Jamestown, that is in Virginia. It could have been better, she said. That is, our Popham Colony could have been better, both established in 1607 and by generally the same English interests. We could have been a contender, she was sort of saying. But I want to jump from 1607 now to the Second World War. I've recently read two wonderful historical books. Doris Kearns' No Ordinary Time about the Roosevelts during the Second World War, and Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile that covers the bombing of London during the World War II. And here are some facts I'm going to give you, but I think the story itself, this little anecdote, also has room for fiction. So both Kearns and Larson agree on important facts here. Churchill is living at the White House and doing everything he can to persuade FDR to aid England against Hitler's aerial bombardment. I think the fact that he would stay at the White House for a number of weeks in itself is pretty amazing, and I don't think it's happened since, especially with these two characters, Winston Churchill and FDR. There's an anecdote during that time, but I find quite lovely. Winston is in his own room at the White House, and we might expect he had his own room. He had just taken a bath. Churchill insisted on taking 2 baths every day, no matter where he went. He is standing stark naked, looking much like a pink, fat baby. And those are his own words. We'll take him at his word there. When someone knocks at the door, and Churchill's bodyguard and valet, a man named Thompson, opens the door a crack, and there's FDR in his wheelchair. And realizing the situation, says he will come back later. He says, "No, no, no, no," barks Winston Churchill. He opens the door wider, still naked as he can be. And he adds, "As you can see, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." And now that happened, but other things, we don't know what happened. It's the plausibility. For instance, did he have a cigar stuck in his mouth? Probably. Did he have a drink in his hand? Probably. Was FDR able to give us one of his great laughs? Probably. Was Eleanor behind him? Maybe, or even probably. And so the real story of what happened is coming from, well, it had to come from those 3 men probably, and they each have their own take on it. And if you wanted to write a story about that or have a movie about that, and you wanted to have accuracy, my God, there's so many possibilities. What are people thinking? What are the motivation behind it? What is this business about getting nude all the time in front of people that Winston Churchill seemed to enjoy doing in front of his secretary? So the real story, especially if speaking as a psychologist, is we don't actually know even about our own selves much of the time. And so that leaves just a whole lot of room for people like me who want to try to write historical fiction. What I have tried to do, to be honest, in my writing is to, what some historical fiction writers do, is to, at the end, have some notes. And in those notes say, yeah, this was fiction, this was as factual as I can get it. So that's my effort, to try to be forthright, although it's just impossible to know some of this, but I make that effort. Okay. So back to the Popham Colony. I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but whether in person or Zooming, and most of you probably have been to the site. But just for a moment, imagine getting on Route 209, going to Phippsburg, you leave the Popham Beach to your right, which, by the way, I think is one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. So if people are hearing this and haven't been to Popham Beach, I certainly recommend it. And then you kind of come to a curve in the road to the right. And I say, stop your car there, move over a bit. and take a look about 300 or 400 yards, and you'll see the Popham. Yes. The fort, thank you. And the huge granite fort. And if you go on the website, and that was during the Civil War, it was built and never saw any action. And if you go on the website, you'll see that it says this is the site of the 1607 Popham Colony. And that just is wrong. That's fiction. So you're parked there still, and instead of going right to the Fort Popham, you go straight, and it looks like a driveway. And so far as I know, there's not even a sign. And you go about 50 yards, and there's a parking lot. And then there's this beautiful lawn that goes down to Atkins Bay, and you've got this extraordinary view of the Kennebec River. And there you are. That's the site of the colony, 1607. And there's some markers there, and there's the map, which many of you have seen, I'm sure, of the colony. And I'd like to say one thing is that it may be a misnomer to call this a colony to start with, and that is it's more of a military and commercial exploration going on here, or expedition. And some were expecting gold and silver in the main hills, and some were obviously going to trade for beaver skin, that sort of thing. And some thought the river might actually be the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so this was, of course, the beginning of colonial exploration, and it was also equally colonial exploitation. You take your pick. I think they're both true. So here are a few facts, and I was told that some people who are listening to this are not part of the choir, may not know too much about the colony. I'm calling it the colony. I'll go along with what people say here. So they came in two ships, the Gift of God, which is sort of a lovely name that you could, make up even as a fiction writer, and the Mary of John, which is kind of boring. And there were like 140 people, men. Nope. Not much sure about that. 120 people, maybe 90 people. Actually, nobody knows. There's just nobody knows. They do know they built a fort from wood and rock and mud, a few cannon pointed at the bay and at the river to defend against the Spanish and the French. And by the way, from my reading, Fort St. George was much more substantial than the fort at Jamestown. But then, I'm partial. Other cannon pointed inland, aimed at the potential attack from natives. It does turn out that the map was quite accurate in determining where these structures were. And we learned this because there was an archaeological dig that occurred between 1994 and 2005. And that was headed by Jeffrey Brain of the Peabody Museum. And he found remnants of a large storage house, the sort of charred underpinnings of the storage house. There was eventually a chapel that was found, or at least, again, evidence of that. Officers' housing, if you want to call it housing, but probably more like shacks, including one for Raleigh Gilbert, who is a 25-year-old admiral and second in command of the colony, or the Fort George. They also found evidence of an iron factory and shards of glass from County Devon, England, suggesting at least the officers drank good wine. And by the way, I think there still is a permanent exhibit at the Maine State Museum for some of these archaeological findings. And I think that the museum is underrated. I think it's some good, really interesting shows there. And this is small, but it's worth seeing. And of course, we know the most amazing thing that happened was the building of this wonderful ship. Well, the original wonderful ship. And which they christened the Virginia for the recently deceased Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. The ship was designed for shallow coastal exploration. Ultimately, though, little exploration occurred. Instead, the Virginia and two other vessels brought the colonists back to Plymouth in the year 1608, 14 months after they arrived. The Virginia, by the way, made at least one more Atlantic crossing to Jamestown, where she might, I assume that she was used at that point as exploring the Chesapeake and the surrounds. I think I also have, and this, for those of you zooming and also for you here, I'm going to skip this over a little bit. There's a list of what I think are really good books about the Popham Colony. One in particular is written by Douglas Rice. This is a very good biography of John Popham. That is Douglas Rice's, the biographer, family, and he came here in 1970, and he taught briefly in Maine, and became fascinated with John Popham, partly because John Popham helped found the school back in Tiverton, England, where Douglas taught, and where my wife Rosie and I had wonderful stay with Douglas and his wife. And he was most kind, taking us all around, showing us everything possible that's to know about John Popham. And so being a historical fiction writer, I turned out, is one of the great things about it is you get to know something about the very interesting dead, as well as a few who are so gracious and still very much alive. So I'd like to use your imagination again and imagine, like Jamestown, we here in Maine create a multi-million-dollar Popham Colony tourist extravaganza. Wouldn't it be marvelous to walk within the grounds of a recreated fort? And I say that with a question mark. Would it be marvelous? Maybe hear a cannon blast. And by the way, Bruce Bork, who was a retired state archaeologist and friend of mine, thinks there might be one of those cannons that ended up somewhere in Atkins Bay, having fallen off the ship. That would be a find. At the recreated fort, we talked to actors playing the role of George Popham, the elderly John Popham's elderly cousin. And it's John Popham, the financial backer, the businessman, and Chief Justice, who died soon after the gift of God and the Mary John took sail, and who is the Popham behind the beaches and the Civil War fort. His cousin George, if that's what he was probably in his 60s or maybe even in his 70s. And it was interesting. There were some very young men there. I'm talking about men that we know about who were heading up the colony or the fort. And then there were some old guys, and I presume some in between, but I'm going to jump over a little bit here. Let's go back to this extravaganza that presumably has been built in your imagination. And we'd meet Digby, the shipwright, and we see the Virginia anchored there in Atkins Bay. And we'd meet someone playing Raleigh Gilbert, the nephew of Sir Walter Raleigh, who is sort of a rock star of those days, who ended up losing his head. Eventually, he got into all kinds of trouble, and the Chief Justice Popham was the one who was presiding over that beheading. Well, not the beheading, but the verdict. And then Raleigh, who took over after George Popham died in 1608, the young 25-year-old Raleigh Gilbert, who is cousin of Sir Walter Raleigh. Here was the question that I tried to answer, sort of. Was George buried at sea, put on ice, then buried in the spring, cremated? Nobody knows. And I can't even remember what I did with them. I think I I put them on ice because cremation was not, it's a long time ago I wrote this. So, I put them on ice, let's say, and then I buried them. And cremation was not a popular way of dealing with the dead in those days. It certainly is a fact, and it's amazing how these men managed to construct all these buildings, the hunting that went on, the cutting of wood to be milled and to burn for warmth, the operation of the foundry, the patrolling of the area, the fishing, double amazing because about half of the men returned to England in 1607, December of 1607, only a few months after they arrived. Who stayed, who went, I have no idea. And I was going to say, if Bud Warren was here, he would be the one maybe to tell us if anybody could. Bud Warren, by the way, is a fellow who is local fellow in Thompson who knows as much about the Fort George and Popham as anybody. And he was very kind to me, and I ended up meeting Douglas Rice because of Bud Warren. I emailed Douglas Rice, this is the Englishman biographer that we went to visit. I just said, I'm coming to England. Could we have tea or a beer? And he wrote back and he said, why don't you come and stay with us? And we thought, well, that might be pushing it a bit, but we did go spend one night with him and then stayed in Tiverton. And that's when he took us all around. So it was because of Bud and that. So Bud, if you're watching, hello. Here's a piece of history I glommed onto. And it's another anecdote, and it has a bit of nudity in it as well. And what from I've read, it's true, sort of. Here's my story. When the settlers pulled up anchor and headed back to England in 1608, and as they slid down the river, a group of natives lined up on what is the portion of the beach on the west bank where the Kennebec meets the bay. They lined up, turned around, bent over, and revealed their rumps. In other words, they mooned the exiting English. Evidently, mooning has a long and multi-cultured history. Evidently, mooning has a long, and I ask you to imagine next time that you walk the portion of the beach where Spinney's restaurant is, consider that fact, that it might have happened. In fact, that practice was reported by the Quinns in their most respected history of early exploration. So my job was to take what happened somewhere and say, how could I not have it happen as the English are leaving? Perfect send-off. And they were wondering with my wife, would they reenact that, I wonder, in this extravaganza? And I said, probably not, but my wife was all for it. So back to where we're walking around our imagined replica of the fort. And maybe we chat with another player, a fellow playing the role of the chaplain. And that would be interesting to me since his name is Richard Seymour, same as mine. I learned about Richard Seymour when in 1972, my wife, 6-month-old son, 6-week-old collie, and I moved to teach on North Haven Island in Penobscot Bay. I knew a bit about Maine from visiting in the summertime, beginning as a kid and then lucking out at age 25 and buying for dirt cheap a cottage on Macmahon Island in Sheepscot Bay. At North Haven, I was told to teach Maine history, of which I knew diddly squat. So I did what many teachers do. I learned a few steps ahead of what I taught. I ran across information about the Popham Colony and found it pretty interesting, especially because I learned chaplain was Richard Seymour. Now, it turns out there were at least 7 Richard Seymours living in England around the turn of the 17th century. The population of England was about 6 to 7 million, about the population of Massachusetts today. There's a fact that kind of blows my mind. The American Seymours get all kind of excited by the fact that Henry VIII produced his only male heir with Jane Seymour. Nevertheless, most of the Seymours, American Seymours, go back to our arrival in Cambridge in 1636. I'm saying this because every time I get in a conversation, people do ask, what's my relationship to this fellow at the Richard Seymour at the Popham Colony. American Seymours arrived in 1636 and are descendants of this poor Puritan Richard Seymour. The Richard Seymour of Popham came from a more lofty branch of the Seymour family. And in those days, in order to get the job that he had as chaplain, you would have to know the right people. And indeed, all the leaders of this colony did come from the West Country, and they all either knew each other well or were related. After my 2-year stint teaching on North Haven, I eventually became a clinical psychologist and professor. And over the years, I've written personal essays, and then a genre that combined the, quote, reality of clinical work with the imagination of making a story of that relationship. In other words, a case story, a story that grapples with the facts of a case while not revealing information that would break our confidentiality. I wanted these stories to get to the gist of a clinical psychology relationship with the patient or the client. I was writing, in a sense, clinical historical fiction. And I have to say, after not figuring out how to market this stuff, I said, to hell with it. Why don't I just have some real fun and write some fiction? And that got me back to what I was teaching in North Haven Island. But let me push this fact and fiction matter a bit more. I believe what is most essential about all of us is our own narrative about ourselves. This is the clinical psychologist in me. This narrative about ourselves is, I would argue, and so would many others, is part fact and part fiction. Memory itself is not an unalterable file we simply draw upon when we need it, like a computer. Memory is always reconstructed, often in a way that better fits our present, so that we can live better in the present. Psychological and neurological research supports this. Again, thank you, Voltaire. Like history in general, each of us creates a self that is most plausible and hopefully as accurate as possible. What historical facts are there about this chaplain, Richard Seymour? We do know that he was not ordained. He was simply a gentleman who was granted the right to conduct communion or the Eucharist. Back in 1930, the president of Yale was a Charles Seymour, and he created a dedication to this Richard Seymour of the Popham. And he was described in this dedication as a most pious person. He didn't know that. He's just pulling it out of his hat. We don't know whether he was pious or he was more like the character I wanted him to be, which was not very pious, much more sensual and all the rest. My guess is, I think he was a cousin of mine, the president of Yale, just didn't know any more than I did. Anyway, Richard was 24 years old. He had graduated from Brasenose College in Oxford, where he began at age 14. Afterwards, Richard attended Middle Temple in London, a kind of law school on the banks of the Thames with an Enlightenment curriculum of the day. It was also a social club for the sons of gentry and the aristocracy. I know a little bit about Middle Temple because on a trip that Rosie and I took, we were given a personal tour by one of the trustees. He offered us lunch in the Grand Hall, and then in their library, we were shown a signature dated 1603, Richard Seymour. It read, validating his matriculation at Middle Temple, where in the same year Shakespeare performed As You Like It. It's very plausible that Richard was in the audience, or maybe he was even one of the actors. And we also visited Brasenose College, Oxford, and attended an evensong services, listened to a wonderful choir and a magnificent organ in total candlelight. It was pretty difficult not to imagine yourself 400 years before. So this was the real fun of trying to write some historical fiction. Another historical fact, now trivia, neither the Popham Colony nor the Jamestown Colony were Puritans. We think of these early characters and colonizations. No, they weren't. That would come 16 years later in Massachusetts. Jamestown and Popham were Church of England folk, or they didn't give a damn about religion. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was motivated by religious freedom and commercial interests, of course, that backed them. And it was freedom from the Church of England that they sought and they got. But what was freedom within the confines of Puritanism was not freedom to someone else. And by the 1630s, Boston ruled its surrounds. Even Puritans with slightly different points of view were shunned. That was the case for my ancestor, Richard Seymour, the poor Puritan. And that's what sent him and his family in the 1630s to the wilderness along the Kennebec to newly found Hartford. So Richard Seymour, my ancestor, was not the right kind of Puritan for the Bay Colony Puritans. Here's another little anecdote that gives you a sense of what the colonists thought about the natives at the time, at least the Puritans. And this takes place in 1630. And this comes from the sequel to Beyond, the Duke of Kennebec. And so when my protagonist, the fictional Richard Seymour, although in fact he was who he was, but my fictional character, he arrives in Boston and he sees a flag flying at the pier. It is red, and on it is pictured a native, a male, nearly naked again, wearing pine cones around his waist, around his middle to conceal his privates. And I doubt whether any native ever wore pine cones, much like that. In one hand, he holds up a bow and the other an arrow. Over him, it reads the words in greeting people who are coming to Boston, "Come over and help us." In other words, help us, the Indian is saying to the likes of Richard when he arrives. And I would guess probably the Puritans actually believed their own propaganda. It is, by the way, this distinction between the Church of England and the Puritans that is highlighted in my sequel to Beyond. The conflict between the Church of England and Puritanism, between the royalists and the so-called parliamentarians, erupted into this English Civil War 200 years before ours, and arguably even more destructive. As neighbors were often pitted against neighbors in this particular war, there was no real battle lines as we have in our own Civil War. And the population of England, as we say, was very small, much smaller than during our Civil War. But what I learned is that the Civil War in England, the conflicts there, remain with us today. It was the role of fundamentalist religion and government, the disparities between the rich and the poor, the power of ideas that entered the bloodstream of our Constitution by those who espouse the age of reason and the Enlightenment. All these still alive today as they were then, and where violence is erupted, and it still does, of course, all over the world. As for Beyond and the Popham Colony, to get back there, I began thinking about writing a historical fiction novel. When I started, it occurred to me that I have an obvious theme. 3 years before The Gift of God and Mary of John entered the Kennebec, which, by the way, was the Sagadahoc then, and upper regions were called the Kennebec. 5 natives from what is now the shores of Bristol, Maine, were kidnapped and taken to England. John Popham's idea was cultivate them and use them as interpreters and diplomats. It might not have occurred by Weymouth, who was a captain of the kidnapping ship, that kidnapping people might just cause resentment instead of friendship. So if writing historical fiction is often a matter of what is plausible, it seemed to me it was plausible that a 24-year-old Oxford Middle Temple fellow who was to become the colony's chaplain might be tapped to educate one of those captive natives, so to teach him all things English and to be of help to the Popham Colony. But what if this friendship between Richard and a 20-year-old something by the name of Skidwaris, which is an actual name spelled differently. What if that becomes the center of the story? A friendship between two young men in their prime of life from wildly different backgrounds. Skidwaris being one of the five. He stayed actually for 2 years. This, as far as I can tell, is part of historical fact. How might it be for both them? And how might Skidwaris, by the way, respond to English women and they to him? This stoked my imagination. A friend of mine started to read Beyond and said with enthusiasm that she'd buy another copy for her 14-year-old boy. And I cautioned her and I said, well, maybe you better finish reading it first. Maybe it's a bit salacious. And my first cousin here today poked fun at me. She said, she thought maybe I started my own genre, and that's called colonial porn. I was reared on John Updike and Philip Roth, among others. I do believe people had sex lives in Elizabethan England and England under James I. Indeed, it might have been a rather lascivious period throughout Europe. Anyway, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a Freudian bent, so that's the way it is. Is it not plausible that two young men became great friends, learned from each other? What if they helped keep the peace in the New World? What if some violence did occur, but they nipped it in the bud? And what if the young boy who was on board actually was in disguise and is, a matter of fact, or a matter of my fiction, a teenage girl? What if the native leaders are willing to barter their women? I'm not an expert in this sort of history, but it seemed possible to me. What would have been like to attend the first Thanksgiving, where Chaplain Richard conducts the Eucharist to a mixed congregation of English and natives? How might native groups, one on the western side of the Kennebec in the Bodenham area right now, be different than those living in and around the Sheepskin and the Damariscotta area? The Bodenham side tended to agriculture. Those to the east tended to hunting and gathering. This is a fact, at least as far as I can tell. Were they friendly? Native groups way down east did in fact attack a village in the Saco, killing quite a few, or so I read. What do you call these native groups? The French had some names for them, English had some names for them, and I kind of gave up. Groups migrated, and I chose to identify just the groups that I was talking about around mostly the Kennebec and the Damariscotta area. And I used the word Muwashan. And it's a word that came up a little bit later on in early American history. There was something called the Muwashan Confederacy, and I just the word Muwashan just struck a fancy with me. What does it feel like to hunker down in the New World? And to answer all these questions, you must go to the most plausible, and sometimes you just go for a good story. So the Popham Colony put up stakes 14 months after they arrived. Apparently no disease, cold as hell frozen over. Even so, in the spring of 1608, 2 ships returned and stayed until October. Little to nothing is known about who or how many returned with the supplies. Perhaps a few orphan children brought to do some of the dirty work and God knows what else. No evidence. No slaves, evidently, but who knows? What the supply ships did bring back was bad news for the Popham expedition. Remember, by this time, Raleigh Gilbert became president of the Fort George. I use these Fort George and Popham. So it doesn't matter which you use, they mean the same thing. The news was that the older brother had died. That is, Raleigh Gilbert's older brother had died. Raleigh was now in line to inherit the Gilbert Castle and thousands of acres not far from Exeter. Was he to go back to his inheritance, or some might say continue to freeze his ass off in the New World? There were financial difficulties as well. The recently deceased John Popham's wife and son were in charge of his estate that included interest in the Plymouth corporation that oversaw Fort George. As with so many entrepreneurial undertakings, this then and now, it's the human aspect that often leads to failure. And by the way, on Rosie's and my trip to England, and with Douglas Rice's help, we got a tour of the Gilbert Castle. The tour was led by Raleigh Gilbert's great grandson, Humphrey Gilbert. And he was charming in a rather Hollywoodish English as we see them way. He was kind of ruffled, bemused English aristocracy. And he served us terrible instant coffee in his castle kitchen. He didn't know if any of his 3 children would keep up the tradition of living in the castle. And there was some sadness there with him in that, but that was some years ago. And maybe now one of those children has seen the historical light and will inhabit that kitchen. A couple of historic facts about the protagonist as he continues in the second book, the book of the Duke of Kennebec. Historical fact, still as a young man, he becomes a secretary to the ambassador to Venice, a remarkable Henry Wotton. Just meeting these remarkable people, all of them did, and all of them remarkable. Perfect for a fiction writer. Living in Venice as a young man, yep. Think of the political intrigue and think of the Venetian courtesans, and you're off and running if you're a historical fiction writer. After that, Richard became secretary to the Earl of Northampton. While in that position, he married Jana Washington, and they had a son, Spencer, named after the Earl's wife's family, also the ancestral family of Princess Diana Spencer. So there you are, Richard was running around in highfalutin company back then. As for the Washington, I just haven't done my genealogy. I didn't know whether George was involved in her family tree. I imagine he was. Along with the Earl, our protagonist Richard gets gobbled up in the vortex of the English Civil War that I mentioned a few minutes ago. We also know how Richard gets jailed, for being a royalist. There is much left to the imagination, however. I imagine, given the extraordinary times of his life and the vantage point as a secretary to Wotton and to Earl of Northampton, the fact that he had been to the New World, very few people had been, that this guy was an interesting guy. Therefore, I was eager to read 3 letters to his older brother that were residing in the British Museum. And so I was saying, what intriguing content must be in these letters. But it was mostly about Richard's laundry. So it could well be that my hero, my alter ego for 2 or 3 years, is actually a real dullard. I love historical anecdotes, as you might guess, given Winston Churchill and the Native American mooning and so on. This last one I offer comes without nudity. In my second novel, I have Richard meeting the Earl of Northampton. The Earl has a title, and so Richard is introduced to the Lord Privy Seal, which, as I understand it, means you are in charge of organizing royal events. At the introduction, the Earl quips, "Lord Privy Seal is indeed my title, but let me assure you, I am neither a lord, a privy, or a seal." And this is a quote that I got from some history book, so maybe it's real. I figured if he's going to crack that joke once, he's going to crack it a lot of times. So it seems to me plausible that our Richard got to hear those very words. Lastly, let me add that I think it better that we visit the site of Fort George or Popham Colony as it is, rather than as a grand tourist attraction. I have 2 minds of this sometimes, but usually I think it best to leave that site alone. Go to it, this tucked in little landscaped, and imagine as you stand on that lawn and look up river, how that might have been for the so-called colonist. Use your imagination, facts and fiction. Thank you.
Richard, I really thank you for this. We've had history talks that were claimed to be fully serious. We've had rigging talks, we've had geographic descriptions, we've had Indian culture, Native American culture. I think the idea of tying together history and how you make a historical concept now understood to people who are here, I think that's really valuable and I appreciate it. I would point out a couple of things. First of all, we have had beyond, oh, what have you got? Would you get that? What, get closer? What are you saying? All right. Get close. Would you bring me, Ken, that book over there on the table? No, but that's mine because I've read it and I want your name on my book.
Let me just
Don't-
say one thing if you don't mind.
No, please go
I've
ahead.
got
This is now the advertisement.
This is the second book. It's not as, there just aren't many pages as it looks like. Really, I mean, it is heavy and it reminds me of my favorite of all reviews of books. And it comes from a review of one of James Michener's books. I think it was Texas or Alaska, one of those, goes on and on and on forever. And the review was simply, don't read it and don't drop it on your foot. I'm not saying that about this. Read it if you wish.
We have here at Mainsford, when I came in here 10 years ago, and we had a very, very small collection in our what is now the Jane Stevens shop. There was a copy of Beyond. There were several copies of Beyond. Okay. And I think it's to your credit or someone else's. No, to your
No,
creatures. They're gone now. Yeah. They've been sold. They've been sold. I know I read mine several years ago. It was the first time I learned anything about the Popham Colony. And then I encountered people who knew more about the history and they said, no, you really got to read these Middle English text interpretations in the appropriate spellings that have to be interpreted in order to really get information about what's going on. In fact, it's a historical invention. We don't know what's going on. And before I get my signature on, where's my book? Did you bring it over? I want him to do this. It's a dramatic, this is a dramatic event, Ken. Richard knows this because I introduced the two of them. There is a young woman who has chosen to write for us a story about the construction of the ship. It's called Digby's Journal. It's not completed yet, although we're getting the artwork together. It should be available, and it'll be available in our store here. And she encountered this same thing. I mean, we knew that George Popham died, and she and I had a discussion, as you did. Well, what do we do with the body? It's February. What are you going to do with this body? Are you going to dig up a hole underneath the chapel and bury it like he traditionally could? Nobody's going to do that. All right. And I'm not quite sure. When there's a discussion about a possible supply ship coming, a second ship earlier. Okay. It had no name. And so we talked about it. I said, Katie, you can give it a name. Invent that. That's what the historical fiction is. And in fact, by combining these two, you can really get a decent story out, and that entertains and teaches. And I appreciate what you've done tonight to admit that we don't know it all, but we can still put together a structure that will teach people about what's going on. Now, would you please sign my book?
With a flourish.
A flourish, yes, spell it with a flourish. And then we'll open the floor to questions if anyone have any. That's wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much. Are there any questions from the in-house audience? Yes, Orman would. I'll be glad to.
Oh, I just happen to have a couple of copies. I do have some, and also you can go to Amazon.com like everyone else. Unfortunately, that's the best, probably. Well, right here would be the best. I'll give you a real reduction here, but Amazon has it, and there probably is going to have to be a third printing of Beyond because I'm running out, and I think that main authors publishing is also real low. So. Oh. Yes, the Kennebec, yes.
So for the Zoomers people, the comment was that the Duke of Kennebec is available on Kindle.
Yes, Kindle, yes.
Any other questions from the, yes, go ahead. Oh, you're, yeah. want to say in 1524, explorer named
Yeah. Yeah, what?
It did happen. And we have a better, we have a,
Ah,
so the comment from the audience was that Verrazano was mooned in 1574 by a series of Native Americans. I can
that's
tell
where I
you,
got it. Now, did it happen?
but
In my heart, it happened.
Orman will support this because we saw this in a lecture. I'm sorry, Rob Stevenson's in here, but several years ago, Rob, our shipwright who built the design or helped construct the Virginia, took a small series of bateaus up to reproduce the Battle of Quebec, right? I'm not exactly sure, but they dragged these boats all the way up to Quebec. And then they reproduced what the Americans were unable to capture Quebec. And so the story was there that they mooned the British before they tried to work their way back. And so we have pictures of Rob and a whole crew actually doing this. So this is a rather consistent cultural effect. Right?
Oh, we could go let that one go by.
Yeah, I think you can put that in another story. Any questions from the audience?
Well, I have one, and that is, what is your experience as a psychologist give you in your writing of historic fiction?
I'm hoping it gave me a sense of dialogue in that I've tried to write, as I had mentioned, essays, personal essays, but also stories about people I've worked with. So, and that was mostly dialogue. So whether that I did succeed in that way or not, I don't know. And it's also, I think, looking for people's motivations and recognizing that there is much more beyond the facts, that we are human beings and we're complicated.
Any comments from the Zoomers? Any more questions here?
You mentioned the Maine State Museum display, and I think they've been closed, but haven't opened again since a couple of years, because of some type of water damage or something.
Okay. If there are no other questions, Phil, would you come and give a small gift to our speaker here?
Thank you for educating us. We hope we'll have some consigned copies of your works for people to enjoy here. And I want to present you with a Maine's First Ship hat, so you can broadcast the project that celebrates what you write about.
Indeed.
So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. I hope to wear this at some point as we sail up or down the Kennebec. Thank you. Thank you all.